heading out, just a few announcements. First, Ben come, and he has an announcement he'd like to make about the AV Club.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
If you don't like speaking in front of crowds, wait until everybody's on vacation. So you guys may or may not know I'm in the back in the sound booth. One thing you may not know about, if you have difficulty hearing, we do have assistance for that. The other thing is, when the fall starts, we're going to need some more assistance back there for our audio video. If you have any experience, that's welcome. If you have no experience, that's also welcome too. Just a willingness to learn. Right now we have 4 wonderful volunteers that we cycle through there every other week. And we want to make sure that everybody gets great. We're going to have some training going on just to kind of get familiar with how all the audio and video works around here. So if you know anybody, if you are interested yourself, please let me know. So I have to.
Fifth Sunday lunch coming up at the end of the month. Make note of that. July 21st through the 26th, we're going to have our summer Bible conference and service week. So just note that coming up as well. And email went out about that, but the more information will follow. But that's our summer Bible week. There's a youth. There's a children's ministry time that coincides with that and runs alongside of that during that time as well. Connection card, take a minute and fill that out. Put that in the pocket of the back of the chair in front of you. If you have a prayer request, need to speak with me or a deacon, let us know. Put your email on there. We'll keep you in touch with what's going on. And then turn in your Bibles to the book of John.
I'll be reading from John 14. These are the words of Christ. John 14, verses 1 through 7.
Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. But we're not so. But I've told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know the way you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on you do know him and have seen him.
Lord, as we examine your word this morning, we ask that you would instruct us, that you would teach us, that we would be convicted by the truth, that we would turn from our sin and believe, that we would see that you have every right to speak into our lives, that we need a creator, we need a king, we need a ruler. But at the same time, we need a friend. We need a Savior that is close. Lord, you are transcendent and immanent. You are far and near. You are everything that our heart needs, from the first and last. Lord, you have started our salvation. You will continue it, and you will complete it. So we rest on you. And we seek your assurance as we search for the truth, that we can know the truth and we can believe it, that we can not just know the truth as what is true as information, but we can know that the truth is embodied by a person, person who relates to us, a person that interacts with us, a God who knows us and saves us. May these things be realized this morning. For your honor and glory, we pray. Amen. This morning we're going to be talking about truth. What is truth? Last week we started with a movie clip. We're going to do that again this week. Last week was Planet of the Apes. We're going to keep the science fiction theme going. This week is The Matrix. You know I had to do it. So let me give you a little background. If you're not a science fiction person, this is going to be weird. All right? It's just going to be weird. But I'll give you a little bit background of the story. What exactly is the Matrix about? It's about the future of mankind caught in a world where our world is run by machines and computers. Now, more and more, that's becoming something that we're considering may be a real possibility, at least in the way that, maybe not to this degree, but at least to in the way that our lives are becoming more and more intertwined with technology. But in this particular case, the machine, the AI, the artificial intelligence, becomes self-aware and begins to battle the humans. And so in order to keep the humans, to keep them from warring against them, they create this massive computer simulation. And they put the humans into what they call the power plant. And they don't know it. They don't know what the truth is. Their minds are part of a computer system and running through a computer simulation. And so as far as they're concerned, what's happening around them every single day, they're living their lives, but they don't really know what the reality is. So one of these particular ideas that makes that made the Matrix so popular was the exploration of the truth. And a lot of the trilogy centers around asking the question, what exactly is truth? What is true? How do we know what is true? And how do we know what is real, right? Now, from time to time, we ask this particular question, is this really happening? Let me pinch myself, right? Is this really true? Is this really happening? But on a deeper philosophical level, to ask questions about origin and questions about meaning and questions about identity, we kind of have to get behind this discussion about what is truth. What is true? Of all the information that we have, what is truth? How can we know truth? How do we define it? And what is ultimately really real? And so this is a very popular question. It's a very important question. Your life revolves around this question, whether you've thought about it or not. Every single day, you're driven by this particular question. Your interaction with culture, with the news, with politics, everything centers around this particular idea because culture is actively asking this question, how do we know what's really real? So as we'll watch this clip, you're going to find them, Neo, being Morpheus, is explaining to Neo what the Matrix is because he really doesn't understand where he is. And he asks this important question. You'll hear him ask this question, what is real? Because Neo's asking, how do I know that what I'm experiencing is real? How do I know what the truth is? What is truth? And so you'll hear him say, what is real? How do you define it? How do you explain it? How can we be assured of it? And so this dialogue through art is a constant, we get a constant and steady diet of this. Now this was back in 1999, and we've come a long way in 20 years. Right? It's been that long. In 20 years of attempting to answer this question of morphing and changing and altering this idea and how we approach it. And it has had a profound effect on the way that we live. And we're going to talk about that this morning. But first, let's watch this clip, and you listen for that as we watch. As it buffers. No? Is this really happening? All right. Yeah. That's all right. That's all right. So I'll just pick it up verbally. All right, it won't be as exciting, won't be as artistic, but this becomes what the clip was attempting, what it's addressing becomes the foundation for what we're discussing this morning. Asking what is real, what is truth, and can we handle that truth? Whatever that is, wherever we arrive, can we handle that truth? Now, you can approach the truth in asking this question. This is where we're going to start. What is truth? And we're going to explore this culturally. So we're asking this question in several different ways. Secondly, we're going to be looking at how relative truth cannot be truth, right? How it cannot be true. How relative truth cannot be true. And then truth is absolute and therefore personal. And so when we talk about truth, we have basically two different ways that we can approach this. First, you can approach this by asking the question, what is truth and how can I know it? To be pursuing it, right? To go after it. The other approach, and this is pretty common as we deal with the media and we deal with day-to-day life and we deal with in the pursuit of truth, because there are so much conflicting information and so many conflicting sources that we throw up our hands and we just say, what is truth? Kind of honestly, really, what is it? More in a manner of, can it really ever be found? Is it something that we can ever really know? Is the pursuit of truth something that is even valid? How can we know that something is really even true? What is truth? What is it? More and more, we're asking that question from a sarcastic point of view, a perspective. What is truth? Because as we interact with people on a daily basis, and as we interact with media and the flow of information, I would say that no matter who you are, you're becoming increasingly more frustrated with what is actually true. How do we know that the information we're receiving really is true? What is behind that? Huge questions about morality, about the morality of those who are presenting us with the truth, and what they pick and choose, and how information is filtered, and those who have particular their particular agenda filters out certain truths. So how can we really know that what we're receiving really is the truth? Is that really what happened? Our culture is increasingly becoming more relativistic in its approach to truth. Now, what does this mean? And it's important for us to examine this so we can understand, understand why we're so frustrated. And no matter how you're approaching the subject, whether you're coming from a more liberal perspective, culturally, politically, or a more conservative perspective, culturally or liberty, or socially, and politically, we're increasingly more frustrated with this. And so we find that culture is speaking into this question about what is truth as relative to the individual. This may be true for you, but it is not necessarily true for me. Now, Christianity, before we get to the passage specifically, enters into this discussion and says, well, no, there are absolute truths. There are moral truths, and there are moral truths that all cultures must bow to. Now, that's a problem, right? That's in a post-Christian culture, in a postmodern culture, that's becoming increasingly more of a conflict with what is the pervasive language and beliefs in culture. So, in an attempt to deal with truth, we have come to this place where we see that those in power misuse the truth. In other words, they seek to use the truth in such a way as a means to gain power. And so, as a way to combat that power, we approach truth by saying, well, there can be no absolute truth. We see absolute truth as an enemy, or as we see absolute truth, the idea as a negative thing, that to believe in absolute truth is really to give power to anyone who can grab hold of it. So whoever takes a position of having the truth, they're the ones that hold the power. So how do we keep groups of power from becoming oppressive? Where did some of this begin? Well, a lot of this comes from a shift from modernity, which is coming out of a Christian influence where culture viewed truth as something that was absolute, to this truth that is relative. There was a philosopher by the name of Jacques Derrida. He is what you may call the father of deconstruction. He had two primary things he wanted to accomplish. First, he had a desire to reevaluate all Western values, to reevaluate every idea that the West has developed. This happened in the 18th century, this happened in the 19th century, it happened into the 20th century, and so he wanted to reevaluate the influences of the West. Secondly, he had, looking at ancient texts and things that had been written, and that would include any particular document, religious document, from political documents, anything that had ever been written. He had a desire to take that particular text and to assimilate it into present-day culture. So what he said is that texts outlive their authors and become part of a set of cultural habits equal to, if not surpassing, the importance of authorial intent. So basically what he was saying is that it doesn't really matter what's been written in the past, and this would include the Bible. It doesn't really matter what's been written in the past. We need to understand that if we cannot assimilate to present-day culture, if we can't alter that meaning, if we can't change that meaning, then it is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the author meant back then, because he meant that at a particular time where in a particular culture that's very different from our culture. Now you have to realize that he's coming from a position of saying that whatever the present day culture is, that's the opinion that matters. So, for example, our Constitution, all right, the United States, to talk about this from a historical, political perspective, our Constitution in the United States, when it was written several hundred years ago, it was written with in a particular context, and there was a particular culture that's very different than today. They didn't have technologies. They didn't have. There were technological advancements. There were aspects of society that were very different, and so when they wrote to address things that were present in their culture, but culture has changed. So we can't take what the author meant and apply it today. We have to take that writing and reevaluate it and reapply it and rethink it in order to find that meaning. And so we come to this conclusion that all truth, all right, is constructed by the people in power. And how do we get behind that to take those who are in power out of power? This is what's behind culture wars and media battles. We must gain the upper hand politically so that we can shape the narrative of what we value economically and socially. So people in the past used to believe that there is a truth that shapes society, but today we believe society has the power to shape the truth. That's a huge difference. It's saying that there isn't a truth out there that's acting upon you, but you are acting upon the truth. That we're the ones that are determining what's true and what's not true. Let's take the roles about men and women as an example. Under modern culture, right, we'd say there is a truth about the roles of men and women that shaped marriage and society, right? So roles of men and women were far more defined. So let's think of maybe the 1920s or 1930s or 1940s. Now, most of us will have to think of that historically, from history, not actually living through it or being a part of it. But going back to the 40s or 50s, what did culture think about the roles of men and women? There were ideas about marriage and society, about clearly defined roles for men and for women. As a result, the result that men had, we've come to find that men use their position to control and oppress women. The Me Too movement, right, is a direct result of a reaction to culture, where a culture of abuse, where men using their position to sexually abuse or harass those who are in a weaker position. Now, I'm not debating the inner workings of this. All right, we're just making broad categorizations to look at the difference between how modern culture and postmodern culture, how this shift has been made, and ultimately how it's affected you. So postmodern culture says that society will shape the truths about the roles in women, the roles of men and women in society. So before, there was an outside truth that said men have this role, women have this role. Now we're saying that society will shape the truths about the roles of men and women. So it becomes very important for those who are in a weaker position to be in a position of power, because we believe that those who are in power have gotten there because they have constructed and used the truth in such a way to oppress other people. So women or minorities, in cases of oppression, react in such a way to those who are in power, saying that society will shape the truths about the roles of individuals. And so there's a movement in the other direction. So those in the power are seen, there's an attempt to undermine that, to bring everybody to an equal standing, to an equal level. Now, the result of that is that the downside is that as a product of that is that women are beginning to dehumanize and emasculate men to gain an upper hand, to control the environment, right? Seeking equality, however that may be defined, even to the point of absurdity. Even if it's absurd. So, at the risk of abandoning sensible differences, the necessity of those differences, we may engage the absurd and even unlivable situations where in culture we can't even talk about the interactions between men and women, because it's impossible to find any kind of common ground. And this is part of the reason why we're so frustrated in this search for truth. We have so undermined the process to get there that we have experienced incredible frustration. Intertwined with this is a resurgence of, or a shift in the obsession with money, right, as a marker for a woman's worth. Continual dissatisfaction with any cultural gains. So what ends up happening is the group that is attempting to move against those who are in power, there's never a point of satisfaction which they can say, we have come to a place where we're satisfied with the particular conditions. That it's a constant struggle with who is right in a search for truth, because ultimately, how can we really ever know what exactly is true? And so group identity becomes the thing that's most important. So that's why what you experience when you read the media, or what you hear in politics, or what you hear between men and women in culture, is that anyone who says that they have the truth, and this is why people hate Christianity, And this is why, and when we look at the passage, this is why people hate those statements that Jesus makes about being the way, the truth, and the life, of saying there's an absolute truth, there's only one way to the Father, there's only one mediator between man and God. To make those statements, they're very narrow and oppressive. That's why that's why a post-Christian culture hates Christianity. Because to make a statement like that is oppressive. So they see Christianity as this oppressive power move. That what you're attempting to do is to take power over people and control them. And so, what happens within groups? Groups construct truth today. It's group against group. There is no truth. There is no ultimate truth. And so, in order to get rid of the absolute truth, in order to have a society that works, then there cannot be one group that is better than any other group. You cannot say that you have a position of authority. So, the purpose of education, the purpose of work, the purpose of politics, the purpose of, and religion itself, ultimately is not to find the truth, but it's for you to gain an identity. To have something that you identify with that gives you purpose and meaning, that gives you a story. So the question isn't whether or not it's true. The question has become, are you satisfied with the identity that it shapes for you, with who it calls you to be? It's your identity. It's your story. Whether or not it's ultimately true doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not it's true. So when you get to the issue of morality, it's very difficult to pin anyone down on anything moral. And this is why it becomes frustrating for those, even for those who are on both sides. In any type of dialogue, you can't have one, because there is no place in which we can say there is a morality that exists. Morality is constantly shifting. It's constantly in flux. It's constantly moving based on societal changes. And therefore, when you look at culture, you might be saying, well, doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. This is absurd. Well, it's the result of looking at truth from a relative perspective. So we would prefer relative truth over eternal. There's nothing eternal. Relative truth over meaning. There can be no meaning. Nothing will last, right? What you do will not last. Time is not really real in the sense of connection to what you do day in and day out. And so that we come back to the question that we ended up watching the clip, but that makes the philosophy behind the movie so significant. What exactly then is real? And how do you know what's true? And is life more than just your experience? But there must be a constant. There must be a constant. And this is what the Bible is arguing, that relative truth leads us to a place where there is no meaning. And if there is no meaning, then we have a huge problem. We have a huge problem for the day-to-day, the ongoing of life as we go to work and as we get up and as we interact and as we engage in relationships. We have a huge problem for the day-to-day. There must be a constant. Now, as you've been sitting here, you have been breathing, right? And you probably, as you've been listening to me, or if not, your mind is probably, wandering. I've been on both sides, right? Right? Your mind wanders, but you're thinking about something, and you're probably not thinking about breathing. All right? Now you're thinking about breathing, because we're talking about it. But the vast majority of the time, you're not thinking about breathing. It's just something that happens. Now, what's interesting about breathing is that every time that you take a breath, as far as how important breathing is, every time that you take a breath, it resets basically a 3-minute clock to the end of your life. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but there's about 3 minutes, right? That's about how long you can last without air. For me, it's a whole lot less. It's more probably like 60 seconds. But we'll just say about average on 3 minutes. Every time you take a breath, right, you're resetting. You're really kind of resetting. All right, I'm going to live 3 more minutes, right? I'm going to live 3 more minutes. I'm going to live 3 more minutes. But you don't think about that. Now, what happens if you end that, if that comes to a stop? You cease to exist. It's something that is necessary. It isn't relative to all human beings. It's vital. Now, you can interact with it. You can even affect it by thinking about it. You can affect it. So, you can control that breathing to a degree, but you can't stop it. It's something that's necessary. It's something that's required. It's a constant that exists. It's relative to all human beings. It's vital. So we have to come to this conclusion, just like breathing, if nothing is vital, if nothing is absolutely necessary, then nothing can exist. You cease to exist. There is no purpose and meaning and definition for existence at that point. And though we may not necessarily always be thinking about reality, we can interact with it, but our interaction with it cannot be to the point where we can change it. And this is the problem with present culture, looking at society as the means to shaping truth rather than truth being the thing that should be shaping society. Now, you might want truth. You might say, but I want proof of this absolute then. If there is an absolute, then I want proof that it exists. That's a valid question. It's a valid response. What evidence do you have for this truth? Scientifically speaking, right, we like evidence. So we'll say, if you can't show me that it's true, then I'm not going to believe it. If you can show me that it's true, then I will believe it. If you can prove to me what's true, then I will believe it. You know the story when there were several. It's been some time now. Maybe it's been 8-10 years now. But I remember we took a family trip up to Gettysburg. And as we were taking this tour of Gettysburg, they were telling us all of these, facts about Gettysburg and about what happened there. And there was this one particular fact which I didn't know about Arlington Cemetery. It just struck me as so interesting because it was something that I had no idea. You're familiar with Arlington Cemetery. Maybe you've actually been there. It's an amazing site. Right? If you've ever stepped into Arlington Cemetery, or if you've even seen pictures of the rows of people who have been buried there. But they talked about the history of Arlington Cemetery. Originally, that land was owned by General Lee. And in short, the Union took that particular land and had come to a point where the cemeteries where they were burying Union soldiers up to that particular point had become full. And so they were looking for property. And so looking at Arlington, Lee's, his estate, his property, said, there's high ground here. This is actually good for a cemetery. And not just that, let's bury Union soldiers in Lee's background. In his backyard. We'll take advantage of needing the space, but also just kind of sticking it to them. So the Union began to bury soldiers there. By the end of the war, there were all these Union soldiers that were there. Lee gave up the property, and that's ultimately what became Arlington Cemetery. Now, there's other details in there. I'm just trying to keep it short. Now, those are particular facts about history. You can review those facts. You can know those facts. You can... as I'm telling you those particular facts, and based on what I would say most likely you'll leave here and you may repeat that based on what I've told you today, which you will not investigate at all, believing that there is history, for the most part, that backs that up. People have written this down. We can categorize it. We can log it. We know that this is true. Now, that piece of information, what does it cost you to believe that? Nothing. It costs you nothing to believe that piece of history. Most of the time when we talk about engaging truth, we talk about truth in such a way, that really has no effect on us whatsoever. We want proof. I will not believe it unless it is true. If it is shown to be true, us believing it doesn't take much effort. It doesn't require much because it costs us nothing. Now, there's another story in John 11 that is recorded. It's a story where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Now, this is a pretty important story because, number one, it's a miracle. And we would definitely categorize this as a miracle because, generally speaking, and I don't know how your week went, but I did not see anybody raised from the dead this week. Nor have I heard of anybody raising from the dead. Nothing that can be actually verifiable. We know that this is something that does not occur. Now, this event, as it's recorded in John, there's some very interesting things that occur. There's this town. We would say it's a relatively small town, so everybody would know who Lazarus was. They would know that this guy died. There would have been a funeral. They would have buried him in this tomb. They would have put the rock over the tomb. They would have known Mary and Martha. They would have known the family. Whereas there's a lot of interconnected tissue here between people, between culture, between the community. So now Lazarus has been dead. He's been dead several days. Jesus comes and he tells them, roll the stone away, calls Lazarus. Lazarus comes out in all of his burial garb. They unwrap him, and here is Lazarus. Now, what's interesting is the next scene. And this is where the story picks up in John 11, verse 45. It said, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So there was a certain group within the crowd that saw this happen, multiple persons that went to the Pharisees and said, they tattletaled on Jesus, right? They were like, we're going to go tell the Pharisees what you did. So they went and tattled on Jesus about what happened. Now, what's interesting about this story is how the Pharisees responded. The Pharisees accepted what they said. So when they went to the Pharisees, this is where it picks up in verse 47. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. They didn't have a debate about whether or not Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. They didn't talk about whether or not resurrection was true, whether or not they didn't do anything. There was no scientific investigation. There wasn't. It said, here are the witnesses. This is what, and we have to know that there was more dialogue than what's presented here in the gospel, right? I mean, there was a conversation. They went and told, but you have to think about what was that conversation like, right? They went and explained to the Pharisees that this is what happened. Now, you have to know that the Pharisees would have inquired. They wouldn't have just gone, oh. They would have said, well, what exactly happened and what took place and what, after the dialogue had occurred, after the men had been shown credible, the witness had been shown credible, they accepted this as fact, that this has occurred. There was a man named Lazarus. He was dead, and he was put into a tomb. He remained there for several days. They had rolled the stone onto the tomb. That is how long it had been. Then Jesus came. They rolled the stone away. He called to Lazarus, and he came out. Those were the facts. What's interesting about this is that they believed that this was true. They believed that this was true. They accepted this as testimony. There wasn't a discussion any further about whether or not this occurred. They said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Now, what's interesting about the way that we approach truth is that it really isn't from this perspective. We really aren't true about the way that we think about truth and its proof. In that if you show me something to be valid, then I will believe and submit to that truth. They believed this truth, but they did not submit to them. They denied it, in essence, its reality. They attempted to undermine it and work against it. If you do not believe that Christianity is true, it's not an issue of proof. It's not an issue even of proving it. To believe that if somebody can prove something to you, that you will believe it and own it, or believe it, right, make it a part of your belief system, follow it, that is not reality at all. We don't really understand how we interact with truth. We are only interested in truth to the degree that it serves our purpose. And we're not properly evaluating our motivations, and they're clouding the issue. It's not an issue of proof, it's an issue of motivation. And this is where we get to the problem of relative truth, or why relative truth is so attractive. In other words, your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. It makes it very convenient. It makes it very convenient for us to maneuver the truth in such a way to serve our purposes. It doesn't matter ultimately then what can be proven to you, that your motivations are very much a part of this process, that you don't want to face reality, right? We don't want to face reality. And this is what Paul's arguing in Romans 1. He's saying that there's something inside human beings that on a day-to-day basis, you know this thing is true, but yet you don't want to face the reality. And we have prejudices against the Bible because it costs you something to believe it. People don't believe the Bible not because it's an issue of proof. People don't believe the Bible because there's stuff in the Bible that talks to you about your life and you don't like it. You don't like it. Your motivations are the thing that are undermining the reality. There are many reasons why people don't like church. Some people have had legitimate bad experiences, have been legitimately hurt by the church. The church is not perfect. But one of the very common reason is that people don't like church and don't want to be in it is because they don't want to face the reality of what is being said in church. They'd rather not think about it and just stay home. A relative truth makes this very easy. Right? It gives us the ticket to say, I will be the one who will determine what's true and what's not. So it makes it far easier just to stay home, or far easier not to engage what may very well be true. And that's our motivations that are clouding the issue. It's not an issue of proof. And so we take the truth and we determine that we'll be the ones who will shape it. Now, this leads us to how relative truth cannot be true. So what exactly, in this discussion about what is truth, all right, what exactly is true, to take a sarcastic approach to this, how can we really know what is true or not? The Bible says that we can know truth, and we can know that there is an absolute truth, that our motivations are a sign that we're not really honestly dealing with the information that is being given to us. Rather, we are being motivated by what we would prefer to do. So how relative truth cannot be true. The first way that we know this is morality, right? What outrages us, and you can think through what makes you morally angry. It could be small things, it could be large things, but think about reading a story where there's something unjust that's done, where we are outraged by this event. I read this illustration about a professor. He's a professor of ethics at the University of Illinois. He begins his introductory to ethics classes by asking how many of the students believe that truth is relative, right? And more, right, as he asked this particular question, more and more people are raising their hands. Truth is relative. There is no absolute, right? There is no absolute. To say that is morally wrong. It's arrogant. It's oppressive to claim that there's any type of absolute truth. So they raise their hand, they put them down. It says usually 2/3 to 3/4 of the class thinks in this manner. So he discusses the syllabus, he talks about testing dates, papers, and content of the course. And then he informs that the method for grading will be according to height. And he says, somebody always says, well, that's unfair. He goes, well, and of course you immediately think, all the tall people, Chris, right? And the tall people think, I'm in, right? Got to be the tall people, got to get A's to the tall people. So he flips it around and he says, the short students will all get A's and all the tall students will flunk. Well, there's outrage immediately. Your grading system is not fair. And he says, I can grade however I wish. But then the students insist, but what you ought to do is grade us according to how well we learn the material. You should look at our papers and exams to see how well we have understood the content of the course and grade us on that. Everybody goes, yes, yes, yes. That's what you ought to do. And he replies and he says, wait a minute, you're telling me that I ought to do something? You betray your alleged conviction that the truth is relative. He says, if you were a true relativist, you would realize that there is no external standard to which my grading should conform. If my truth and my ethic lead me to an alternative grading system that you deem inappropriate, c'est la vie. I will grade however I wish. See, their moral outrage leads them to a place where we must conclude. You have to conclude. The moment that you say to anyone you ought to do something, it becomes an absolute. And so, if truth is relative, then your moral outrage must also be relative. If I am considered an intolerant person because of my narrow truth of Christianity, you must, though, know that your outrage over your intolerance is relative, and therefore there are some situations where my narrowness is acceptable. For it to always be unacceptable is to suggest that there's an absolute truth. The moment that you say that it's always unacceptable is to claim that there's an absolute truth. Relative truth cannot be true. It doesn't matter how much we say that relative truth is true, it cannot be true. It's impossible for it to be true. It's impossible. But it's one of those things where that forces us into this position where we've got to ask some questions about our intentions, our motivations. Why is it that we are incapable of coming to that place of accepting that this is the reality? Why is that so hard? Why is it so hard when we open the Bible and we look at this, the challenges that it makes of our morality? Why is it so hard for us to embrace it and to believe it? It's not about proving that this is true. Our motivations betray us. There is something at play, something much deeper at play. That the human condition, that the Bible's explanation of sin and motivation, that there's evil within us, a selfishness that is pervasive, that presses us to deny the very truth that we know, the very thing that we know is true. And this is what Paul is saying in Romans 1. So when we enter into relationships, when we talk about marriage, or we talk about friendship, or we talk about work, we talk about ethics, just the way the students are responding, right? He says, I'm going to grade you by height. But they immediately say, but that's not what you ought to do. There's no law. It's not like they could say, here's the civil law that says, they said, that's not what you ought to do. This is a better way. This is the way that you should grade us. What's informing them? There's a fairness that they're calling out to. There's this thing inside of them that says, we know how this should go. This would be the fair way to do it. This is the right way to do it. And even though we know that about relationships, and we know that about life, we suppress it. We press it down. We push it down. We prefer a truth that is relative because it's what's expedient and what's convenient. Now comes Jesus' response. A relative truth creates an impersonal culture. A culture that pits life against life. There is no unifying concept or idea that says human beings should treat each other with dignity and with honor and with respect. It's not something that pulls human beings together. It's something that ends up isolating them, separating them, pushing them apart. Truth is absolute and therefore personal. So what does this passage tell us? What is Jesus' response? Well, first, truth is a person. Verse 6 and 7. What does he say? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Truth is a person. If there is a moral absolute, then there is meaning. And if there is meaning, that means this is personal. And if personal, then there's a God who is taking this personally. See, moral outrage is on the level of what is personal. You're morally outraged about what one person has done to another. But we're not morally outraged when the praying mantis wife eats the head of the praying mantis husband. That's what happens. In nature, have you ever seen, do you know that that's what occurs? When the praying mantis, when they mate, after they're finished, and this is gross, I'm just telling you the way nature works. The praying mantis, all right, you've got about a 50-50. The praying mantis wife eats the head of the praying mantis husband. But there's no one out picketing against praying mantises. But when a human being commits that crime, well, not that one, but any crime against another human being, right? We say that it's personal. In the case of the praying mantis, it's just nature. But why is it that all of a sudden we want to say nature, 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 but then all of a sudden we make this shift and we say, no, this is personal? When does it become personal? How does that occur? The only way that it can ever be personal is if there is an absolute. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. This is a personal issue. It's personal because there is an absolute morality. There's something that's informing you about the way to live. The way to live, the directives, have everything to do with the way that you and I interact, with how marriage is structured, and how friendships are structured, and how parenting is structured, and how businesses are to be run, and governments are to be run. It's personal. It's not just information, that the truth has an end to the way that society and civilization and the way that our families and our schools and our businesses, the way they're run and the way that they look. It's personal. But we don't see that the cost of making truth subjective, or the cost of making the truth relative, is to lead us in a direction where it's not personal anymore. It's just natural. It's just business. But no one wants to live like that. No one wants to behave like that. Nobody wants to enter into a marriage or into a friendship where, hey, it's just business. Or that's a classic line when the mafia is about to whack you, right? It's not personal. It's just business. Right? It's just business. That's all. As if that's to make it better, right? Yeah, I get it, right? That makes me feel better, right? They personally didn't want to just kill me. It's just business. But that's what moral relativism is. It's just business. In other words, it's just natural. This is the way that things work. But in our day-to-day life, we can't live like this. And when you enter into a marriage, it's not just business. Right? You don't just stand up there on your wedding day and you're making your vows. Those vows are deeply personal. You don't go, well, this is just business. This is just a business contract. And when you hear people approaching that, you go, wow, that's really doesn't seem like a very exciting way, a very deep and profound way to start a marriage. You know, I hear people, who talk about signing prenuptial agreements and entering into contracts and I'm always wondering, I'm not really sure that maybe you're really kind of getting what marriage is and maybe even if you should be entering into it, if that's what you're concerned. That's a business contract. That's not a covenant. That's not what marriage is. But we don't want to live like that in our friendships, and we don't want to live like that in our cultures, in our society, in our schools. You want your teachers of your children to love your children. You don't want them to come in and go, well, it's just business. It's just business. See, this matters because it's deeply personal. And there's a God on the other end who is entering into the fray, and he's saying, don't you understand that this is personal? In the way that you interact with one another, it's personal to me. It matters to me. That's how we explain why it matters to Jesus, whether or not we give a cup of cold water in his name. And as you treat human beings, so you have treated God. That's what he's saying. That this idea of morality is personal to me. And it should be personal to you. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled in verse 1. So, what is the problem here? Our hearts are troubled, but why shouldn't they be? See, Jesus is just assuming, I think he's making an assumption here, human beings have troubled hearts. To be human is to suffer. In this one regard, Buddha got it right. To be a human being is to be troubled. We are troubled in our heart and our soul. You know how I know that we're troubled? Because we're longing and searching for relationship. Because we're troubled because we see the effects of abusive parents or abusive relationships or lives that are broken by lives broken by broken relationships, lives that have no connection, have no source of encouragement, have no source of love, have no source of meaning. Our hearts are desperately troubled. Why would we want to solve that problem by taking the truth and relativizing it, of reducing it to nothing, of saying there is no absolute reason why we're here, an absolute reason why we exist? I was telling my wife last night, I was just talking about, I just watched story after story. There was a couple stories I read this week about two pastors in California, this over the last couple of years, committing suicide. Then there was this comedian this week, this was on another news, a guy, kind of in his prime of his career, kind of commits suicide. And the ever-increasing problem of suicide in our culture, and of mental illness, and this talk of mental illness and suicide. And I just said, there is a link to this and to moral relativism, to telling people that you really have no ultimate meaning here. And your day-to-day life is nothing but just grinding it out. And people are asking the question, why am I here? And there's no response coming back other than make money, look good, do it well, have fun. And so Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Your heart is troubled, and if you're looking to solve the problem of a troubled heart, then come to me, because truth is a person, and it's absolutes. Our insecurities, our frustration, our fear, our anxiety, our sin In other words, the way that we dehumanize people and the way that we say to God, I'm going to do what I want when I want, what troubles us so deeply, what we deny